Welcome to Thoughts and Theories. It was a cool October day in 1925 when the world witnessed one of the strangest and most forgotten wars in modern history. A war that lasted only a few days. A war sparked not by politics or ideology or religion, but by a stray dog. Yes, a simple dog, wandering across the Greek-Bulgarian border, would ignite what newspapers later called the War of the Stray Dog. But beneath this bizarre surface lies something far deeper, a story of human pride, wounded honor, and the fragile nature of peace between nations. To understand this peculiar event, we have to go back to the early 20th century, when the Balkans were a restless and blood-soaked region. Greece and Bulgaria had already fought side by side and against each other within a single decade. They were allies in the First Balkan War of 1912, fighting the Ottoman Empire. But just a year later, in 1913, they were enemies in the Second Balkan War, turning on one another over territory. By the time the First World War ended in 1918, both nations were exhausted, wounded, and humiliated in different ways. Bulgaria had lost territory and pride. Greece had expanded, but its ambitions were cut short by the catastrophic Greco-Turkish War of 1919 to 1922. In 1925, both countries were poor, their armies tired, and their people trying to rebuild their lives. Yet the border between them, especially near the town of Petric, remained tense. Patrols often clashed, misunderstandings were common, and small incidents could easily spiral into bloodshed. And then came October 18, 1925. A Greek soldier stationed near the border was said to have chased his runaway dog across into Bulgarian territory. Accounts differ on what happened next, but the most accepted version says that Bulgarian border guards, perhaps thinking he was an intruder or a spy, opened fire. The Greek soldier was killed. When word reached the Greek camp, emotions exploded. The death of one man over something so trivial struck deep into the Greek sense of national dignity. It wasn't just a soldier who had died. It was an insult to the Greek flag, to the Greek army, to the memory of those who had died in the Balkan and World Wars. Greece demanded an apology from Bulgaria. Bulgaria expressed regret but refused to take full blame. It was a local accident, they said, not an act of war. But pride does not always bow to reason. The Greek dictator at the time, General Theodoros Pangalos, was known for his temper and his authoritarian style. To him, hesitation meant weakness. Within days, Greek troops crossed the border into Bulgaria, marching toward the town of Petric. What followed was short, chaotic, and deadly. Bulgarian civilians fled in panic. Some were killed. Homes were burned, and artillery echoed through the valleys. The Bulgarian army avoided direct confrontation, choosing instead to appeal to the League of Nations, the international peace organization created after World War I to prevent exactly this kind of conflict. The irony is painful. Just a few years after millions had died in the war to end all wars, Europe nearly stumbled again into violence over a dog. Within 3 days, the League of Nations intervened. Representatives from Britain, France, and Italy condemned the Greek invasion and demanded a ceasefire. International inspectors were sent, and Greece was ordered to withdraw its troops immediately. The League sided with Bulgaria and required Greece to pay compensation for damages and loss of life. Pangalos, though furious, complied. He withdrew his soldiers, paid the fine, and publicly fumed about the injustice of the decision. In total, about 50 people were killed, soldiers and civilians together. A small number compared to the scale of world wars, but for those families, it was everything. 50 lives lost to an act of pride. So, what does this tell us? On the surface, it's an absurd episode in history. A minor border incident inflated into a miniature war. But when you look deeper, it becomes a mirror of human nature. The dog didn't cause the war. Human pride did. National ego did. The same forces that push individuals to fight over small insults can push nations into conflict. Think about it. Both sides could have simply talked. A life was lost, yes, but there was room for diplomacy. Yet instead, emotions overpowered logic. The need to save face became stronger than the desire to save lives. This is not just a Balkan story, it's a universal one. From bar fights to boardrooms to battlefields, humans have an ancient weakness. We confuse pride for strength. We think backing down makes us small, when in truth, it often takes more courage to walk away. Pangalos, for instance, wanted Greece to look powerful, but his decision made the country look reckless and desperate. The League of Nations, which many saw as weak after failing to prevent bigger wars, actually managed to resolve this one peacefully. In a way, the War of the Stray Dog became one of its few success stories. But let's step back even further. Why do nations fight over symbols? Why do flags, borders, or national pride matter so much that men are willing to die for them? From a philosophical point of view, it's because these symbols give humans a sense of identity and meaning. A soldier defending his border doesn't think he's defending a line on a map. He thinks he's defending his home, his family, his people. And when that sense of identity is insulted, the reaction is emotional, not rational. In the case of Greece and Bulgaria, both nations were emerging from humiliation. Bulgaria had lost territory after World War I. Greece had lost thousands of soldiers and civilians in the Asia Minor catastrophe. Their collective egos were fragile, desperate to prove worth. So when a single shot was fired on the border, both sides projected years of pain and insecurity onto that single act. History repeats this lesson again and again. Wars rarely begin with grand philosophical disagreements. They begin with small misunderstandings, stoked by pride and fear. The First World War started not because Europe wanted mass slaughter, but because one archduke was assassinated and leaders refused to appear weak. The Vietnam War escalated because of a reported attack on a U.S. ship that may never have happened. The Falklands War erupted over a few barren islands that offered little strategic value. Each time it was pride and reputation, not reason, that lit the fuse. The War of the Stray Dog might be forgotten in textbooks, but it's an important moral lesson about human behavior. It reminds us that violence often hides behind the illusion of honor, that behind every war headline, there's usually a chain of small emotional reactions that no one bothered to stop. It also shows how fragile peace really is. After the war ended, both nations signed agreements, and life went on. But just a decade later, the world plunged into yet another global conflict. The League of Nations, which had managed to prevent war between Greece and Bulgaria, collapsed when faced with greater powers like Germany and Italy. The same pride that led two small nations to fight over a dog would soon drive entire continents to destroy each other again. When you think about it, the story sounds almost absurd. A soldier chases his dog, crosses a line, and dies. His death leads to a war, and that war leads to international condemnation. And yet, this absurdity reflects the truth of human history, how easily emotions overpower logic, how a single incident can trigger a cascade of chaos. But here's the most fascinating part. The same qualities that lead us into war, pride, loyalty, love of country, are also the ones that create unity, culture, and courage. Without them, we might have peace, but we might also lose our sense of belonging. So the real challenge isn't to erase these instincts, but to control them, to recognize when they're driving us toward destruction rather than dignity. The War of the Stray Dog may be forgotten, but its lesson endures. It tells us that civilization isn't about grand monuments or powerful armies. It's about restraint, about knowing when to stop, when to think, and when to say that one life is worth more than national pride. In the end, it wasn't the dog that crossed the border, it was human ego, and that, as history shows, is far more dangerous than any animal. Sometimes, when we look at history, The most ridiculous stories are the most revealing. They show how fragile we are, how even in a century of science, progress, and supposed enlightenment, our emotions still rule us. The War of the Stray Dog wasn't just a small Balkan conflict. It was a reminder that humanity's biggest battles often begin within ourselves. We like to believe that we are rational beings, that wars are calculated acts of necessity, but more often than not, they are emotional outbursts wearing the mask of reason. And that, perhaps, is the real tragedy of the human story. The next time you hear about nations clashing, borders tightening, or leaders making threats, remember that dog running across the border in 1925. Remember how a single step over an invisible line nearly dragged two nations into full-scale war. Remember that peace is not a gift, it's a discipline, one that demands humility, patience, and above all, the courage to not let pride make the decisions for us, because in the end, it's not the dog's war. It never was. It's ours.